Your car didn't fail, it was throttled. Again. You didn't run out of money, you ran into a gate that only appears when you try to convert digits into something the system can't freeze, claw back, or review. The balance was there. The limit was there. The merchant was legitimate, and the terminal still spat out a decline like a sentry stamping your passport with a quiet, final, no. That's not a glitch, and it's not just fraud protection, because random errors don't show this kind of pattern, this kind of targeting, this kind of timing. This is the channel where we map the mechanism without repeating the press release. Uncomfortable truth. The money you see in your app is not your money in the way most people emotionally believe it is, because in a digitized banking system, you own a claim, and the claim comes with conditions. You think you're holding currency. What you're actually holding is permission, wrapped in a user interface that was designed to keep you calm and compliant, while the real control lives behind the screen. That's not ownership. That's custody. And custody always becomes a cage when pressure rises. You keep hearing the mainstream story. It's a security feature. It's consumer protection. It's the algorithm being cautious, as if a machine simply got nervous and bumped you to customer service by accident. That's not an explanation. That's anesthesia. Because when you zoom out, you see the same moves repeating across issuers, across processors, across regions, and always against the same target. The exits from fiat into hard assets. That's not random noise. That's coordinated friction. Here's what they do, and they do it with clean hands and plausible deniability. They retag the merchant. They rescore the category. They reroute the transaction. They insert review steps. They slap cache-like logic on it. They throttle velocity. They raise the decline sensitivity. And then they hide behind the one weapon that never loses: silence. They don't have to say, you can't buy bullion, because a direct ban would spark headlines and lawsuits and uncomfortable questions in parliament hearings and Senate committees. So they do something smarter, something softer, something that looks like a technicality while it functions like a wall. They move the merchant into a high-risk bucket, then they let the issuer's policy engine do the dirty work in milliseconds. You don't get a debate. You get a decline code. And yes, the codes matter. Because categories are the modern battlefield markers, and the merchant category code is the flag planted on the hill that tells the issuer how to treat your purchase before any human ever looks at it. Most bullion businesses are supposed to sit in ordinary commerce categories like precious stones and metals. You'll often see MCC 5094 inches the payments world, which should behave like normal retail from a card rail perspective. But once the transaction path starts smelling cash-like account funding, quasi-cash, financial services rails, or debt repayment rails, you can get treated as if you're not buying a product but extracting liquidity. And that is where issuers become allergic. Fast. That's not semantics. That's a switch. This is why the phrase soft capital control is not melodrama. It's a precise description of what happens when movement is restricted without legislation, and exits are narrowed without announcements. Hard capital controls are blunt and visible, like tanks on a bridge. Soft capital controls are stealthy and bureaucratic, like a new checkpoint that only appears when you try to cross with something they don't want leaving the zone. They don't lock your account outright, because that creates panic. They just make certain conversions unreliable, embarrassing, and time-consuming, because most people will self-censor the moment convenience disappears. And the target is not spending because they're not stopping you from buying sneakers, flights, subscriptions, or nonsense. The target is conversion into a bearer-like asset that lives outside their ledger. That's not A, that's B. That's not risk management. That's exit management. Now, let's talk history, because this isn't a new instinct. It's an old instinct wearing new software. For decades, the financial system has survived on one psychological promise: convertibility. The comforting belief that whenever you want, you can swap your bank digits into something real, and the system will politely let you walk out. In quiet times, they can afford that promise because outflows are manageable and confidence is cheap. In stress times, they can't afford it because liquidity becomes strategic and deposits stop being your money and start being their oxygen. But here's the pivot most people miss. They don't wait until a crisis is officially declared, because by the time the public hears the word crisis, the exits are already crowded. So the operation has always been the same, just updated for the app era. Reduce panic by keeping the illusion of access. Reduce outflows by increasing friction. Reduce accountability by blaming the algorithm. And when people complain, isolate them into individual customer service calls. because atomized outrage never becomes collective action. That's how this works for years, even decades, because most people never test the boundary until the boundary matters. But something is changing. Years ago, you could buy precious metals with a card like it was any other product. And at most, you'd get a surcharge or a fraud text that you could confirm in 30 seconds. Now, more investors report that the same purchase triggers issuer declines, cash advance treatment, or sudden verification steps that conveniently appear only after you try to turn fiat into metal. Years ago, dealers competed on convenience. Now, many steer you toward ACH, wire, or check, as if plastic has become radioactive. Because the card rails have turned into a battlefield where approvals are no longer guaranteed, even when you do everything right. The shift isn't your imagination. It's a tightening of the pipe. And reportedly, this tightening is happening at the same time that the broader system is experiencing funding stress, higher default sensitivity, and more aggressive risk-off behavior inside banks, which is exactly when gatekeeping becomes rational from their perspective. When liquidity is abundant, banks act like retailers of financial services. When liquidity is scarce, banks act like border guards of a shrinking perimeter. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's incentive physics. Now we're in the evidence phase, where you stop listening to narratives and start watching symptoms. First symptom. The declines are category-specific, because you'll see the same card approve normal transactions while rejecting the metals transaction, even when the amount is smaller than your typical monthly spend. Second symptom. The reason is vague because you'll get refer to issuer, do not honor, or generic issuer rejection language that tells you nothing, which is perfect when the real reason is policy and they don't want to say it out loud. Third symptom. The resolution path is friction-heavy because you're told to call, verify, wait, retry, and sometimes you're still declined, which trains you to give up or switch to a slower rail that can be monitored and delayed. Fourth symptom. Dealers adapt quietly because when enough customers fail at checkout, merchants stop offering the method, and then the system can claim, "See, nobody uses cards for this," as if the demand evaporated on its own. And here's the time comparison that should bother you. 5 years ago, the system sold speed as a feature, because speed increases spending, and spending increases fee revenue. Now, speed is being selectively removed from the very transactions that convert paper claims into real assets, because speed in those lanes increases outflows, and outflows increase stress. When the feature set changes in a targeted way, you're not watching innovation, you're watching control. Now let's open the hood, because this is where the few who know separate themselves from the crowd that argues in comment sections without understanding the plumbing. A card transaction is not a simple transfer. It's an authorization request that flows through multiple decision engines, and any one of them can kill it while everyone else shrugs. Your merchant submits the request through an acquirer. The network routes it, the issuer evaluates it against your profile and their policies, and the decision returns in a blink, which is why this feels like magic when it approves, and like injustice when it declines. But the magic is just layered permissioning, and permissioning is the perfect tool for soft control, because it can be tuned without public notice. They don't need to freeze accounts, they just need to make certain merchant categories unreliable, which is a softer word for restricted. The MCC is the starting label, and labels are lethal in automated systems, because labels decide which rules fire and which rules sleep. In the card network's own documentation, certain MCCs are explicitly treated as financial institution merchandise, services, or quasi-cash. And quasi-cash is a red zone because it behaves like cash extraction, not like buying a normal good. That red zone is where issuers commonly apply extra restrictions, where reward programs often exclude earning, where cash advance fees can appear, and where declines become more likely because the issuer's fraud model sees liquid conversion rather than consumption. So when Boolean purchases start being processed or interpreted in ways that resemble quasi-cash logic, the gate becomes predictable. And this is why the phrase shadow ban fits. It's a restriction you can't see from the outside, implemented via classification, enforced by automation, and defended by customer service scripts that never admit intent. Now connect this to the broader liquidity story, because nothing in finance happens in isolation. Banks don't exist to help you buy metal. Banks exist to manage balance sheets. And balance sheets are war maps where deposits are supply lines and outflows are casualties. When a system senses that confidence is thinning, it tries to preserve deposits, because deposits are the cheapest funding, and cheap funding is the difference between surviving a storm and begging the central bank for life support. So if you were sitting in that chair watching funding costs rise, watching asset values wobble, watching counterparties tighten, you would treat easy conversion into bearer assets as a threat because every ounce leaving is a unit of optionality removed from your control. That's why the exits get narrower before the public hears the word reset. Now, the mainstream will push back with a softer version of denial. This is just merchant risk because bullion is high fraud and high chargeback. Yes, fraud exists. And yes, chargebacks are painful. And yes, merchants in thin margin industries hate card fees because a 2% fee can destroy a 1% margin. But that explanation doesn't cover the full pattern, because the pattern isn't just merchant-side policy. It's issuer-side refusal that appears specifically when the asset being purchased is a conversion vehicle. That's not A, that's B. That's not merchant economics, that's system incentives. And here's what the crowd never sees, because they don't look where the real fight happens. When the system is stable, you can pretend card rails are neutral. When the system is stressed, neutrality disappears, because every rail becomes a lever. Every lever becomes a policy tool, and every policy tool becomes a way to keep people inside the digital perimeter. That perimeter is valuable because digital money is trackable, reversible, and controllable, while physical assets are final, portable, and outside the ledger's jurisdiction. So the war isn't against your hobby, it's against your sovereignty. Now comes the preemptive inoculation, because I can already hear the counterattack forming. You are going to see a flood of fact checks that argue semantics, because semantics are the easiest way to dodge the substance. They will say, there is no official capital control, which is technically true in the same way it's technically true that a locked door isn't a prison, if nobody calls it one. They will say, MCCs don't work that way. While ignoring that issuers absolutely use MCCs as inputs for risk, rewards, and policy decisions, and networks publish guidance about MCC usage for certain transaction types. They will say, just call your bank, because customer service is where systemic patterns go to die as isolated anecdotes. So here is your filter for real information, the kind that survives propaganda. Real information is not a headline, not a tweet, not a pundit, not even a viral clip. Real information is the decline reason returned by the issuer, the merchant code in the transaction metadata, the policy wording in the cardholder agreement about quasi-cash and cash-equivalent transactions, and the sudden operational changes dealers make when approvals become unreliable. Real information is also what insiders whisper without names, that risk models are being tuned, that cash-like conversion categories are being watched more aggressively, and that the system is preparing for a world where movement is a managed privilege rather than a default right. And when you hear people dismiss all this as paranoia, remember the first rule of controlled systems. They mock you until the day they normalize it. Now, let's run the future forward, not as fantasy, but as a staged escalation that mirrors how soft controls always expand. First, the mild stage, where the restriction is inconsistent enough to keep most people in denial, because denial is cheaper than panic. You'll see more random declines, more verify identity loops, more temporary holds, and more card programs quietly excluding certain merchant categories from approvals or rewards, all while the average consumer keeps spending happily on everything except the exits. And you'll be told the workaround is simple. Use ACH, use wire, use check, as if needing a workaround is not, by definition, evidence that the normal path is being narrowed. Then the serious stage, where friction becomes policy, and policy becomes routine. Dealers shift to bank transfer first workflows, issuers tighten daily limits, and more transactions get flagged as cash equivalent, which means approvals drop and fees rise and the path gets uglier. You'll also see more enhanced due diligence language, more questions about source of funds, more compliance touchpoints that magically appear only when you try to move value into something final. And the public will still argue about whether it's real because the system will never announce it as control. It will always announce it as responsible risk management. Finally, the extreme stage, where the controls stop pretending to be accidental. Emergency measures get justified by market stability. Withdrawal limits get framed as consumer protection, and conversion lanes get narrowed further, because the system can't tolerate a stampede into final assets when confidence cracks. And even if every sign points to the same conclusion, they still have an escape hatch. They can blame vendors, blame algorithms, blame fraud spikes, blame geopolitical uncertainty, because soft controls are built for plausible deniability. Even if the thesis is right, they can still change the rules mid-game, because rule changes are the ultimate weapon of institutions that can't afford to lose. Now, action. Because awareness without action is just entertainment dressed up as intelligence. You don't control the macro environment, and you don't control the banking consortium's incentives, but you do control whether you discover your limitations during calm weather or during the storm when everyone else rushes the same doors. First, test your rails early with small, legal, documented transactions, because the worst time to learn a payment path is compromised is the moment you actually need it to work. Second, build redundancy across institutions and payment methods, because one bank, one card, and one app are not a financial plan. They're a single point of failure disguised as convenience. Third, preposition optionality in ways that don't rely on real-time issuer permission, which doesn't mean doing anything reckless or illegal, but does mean refusing to keep all your mobility trapped behind one corporate risk engine. Fourth, reduce dependence on leverage and instant credit for strategic moves, because any plan that requires approval from the very gatekeeper you're trying to exit is not a plan. It's a request for mercy. And yes, risks exist, because adults don't pretend there is a perfect bunker. Physical assets have spreads, storage costs, theft risk, counterfeits, and dealer risk, which means you mitigate with reputable sourcing, verification, and sober sizing rather than impulsive hoarding. Bank transfers can still be delayed, reviewed, or reversed in certain scenarios, which is why just wire it is not the comforting solution people pretend it is when pressure rises. So the goal is not perfection. The goal is layers, because layers are how you survive in a system that can tighten rules without warning. Now the identity test, because this is where the crowd splits. Are you here to keep the lifestyle of convenience, even if convenience turns into captivity the moment the system feels threatened? Or are you here to preserve optionality, even if that means accepting friction now so you're not trapped later when the window closes? Are you here to argue semantics with strangers, clinging to the comfort of no official announcement? Or are you here to read the battlefield cues, merchant codes, decline patterns, policy language, dealer behavior, and act like someone who understands that soft controls never come with sirens? Because ordinary people wait for official confirmation, and official confirmation always arrives after the exits are crowded, after the rules are updated, after the story is rewritten. We don't wait for permission. We watch constraints, we map incentives, and we prepare before the crowd wakes up. So I'll leave you with 2 questions that should sting, because they cut through every excuse. If your money is truly yours, why does access fail precisely at the moment you try to convert it into something outside the digital system's reach? And if this is just fraud protection, why does the friction concentrate on exits while entrances, subscriptions, consumer debt, fee-heavy spending remain smooth, instant, and aggressively encouraged? If you want this mapped in real time, subscribe now and join the people who track the signal through the noise while everyone else sleeps inside the story. Because the market isn't malfunctioning when your card gets declined at the bullion checkout. The market is rehearsing control, and the system is practicing how to lock doors without ever admitting they exist.